Churches being vandalized, Monday Musings. I'm sure all of us would agree at this point in time we seem to be living through a unique chapter in history. We have a global pandemic that we still seem to be in the midst of. There's been riots and protests on a number of different levels, and there's also been a very active hurricane season. We still have fires raging throughout California, and so this does seem to be quite a unique time that we're living in. In the midst of all this, something that hasn't really garnered much media attention, which is kind of odd, because if this probably had happened to maybe another religious group, I imagine it would have been more noticed by the media. But there have been a number of churches and also statues throughout the United States and even throughout the world that have been vandalized in some way or another. And so just because this has happened at such a huge level, and doesn't seem to be anything coordinated, it just seems to be individuals doing these things. Even though that's the case, because it has happened so frequently, again, most of it has happened throughout the summer, and because it hasn't garnered much attention in the media for some reason, it's at least worth noting. And for us, it's always important for us to be aware that even when these things do happen, the response of us as Catholics, as a people of faith, is not to not to respond in the same way, but to respond as 1 Corinthians says, we respond in all things with love. So even when we're the target of, discrimination in one form or another, the response should always be, the response of love, as hard as that may be at times. And even to offer forgiveness and to pray for those who have done these things. So I'm just going to share some of the ways in which this has happened throughout the world. I can't remember all these, so I'm just going to have to look at some little notes that I have, and just share about some of these churches and statues that have been vandalized in some form or another. In LA, I'm just going to go in alphabetical order because it was the only way I could arrange it. Again, most of this did happen in the summer. There have been some incidences more recently, but most were happening in the summer as all the protests and riots were in full form. In LA, there was an arson attack on the historical San Gabriel mission, which was founded by St. Juniper Serra, and it was the same. And during that attack, the roof of the church basically collapsed, and most of the walls were completely blackened. Again, someone decided to set this historic church founded by Juniper Serra on fire, and for some reason Juniper Serra seems to be coming under attack, in particular in California, because that's where he founded so many missions. In LA, there was a statue of Juniper Serra that was toppled. In San Francisco, there was a statue of Juniper Serra that was toppled, and the Capitol building of Sacramento, the statue of St. Juniper Serra that had been in near the Capitol building for so long, was taken down. Again, it seems to be this revisionist history where we're kind of judging past events in light of what we're living in. Juniper Serra was actively promoting the dignity of the indigenous people, even though he was living in a culture that wasn't supportive of that. In a unique way, in San Francisco, and this was by Archbishop Cordileone, if I'm saying his name correct, he started a Free the Mass campaign, and bishops usually only actively speak up so poignantly like Archbishop Cordileone had to do if there's some purpose, and he obviously felt it was necessary to speak because the city was restricting worship in such a dramatic fashion. So other places like spas and businesses, they were basically told they had to submit a safety plan. The state would review it, they would approve it, and then it would be implemented. And that was not happening with houses of worship. Archbishop Cordileone even had to say, why can people shop at Nordstrom's at 25% capacity, but only one of you is allowed to pray inside of the church? So interesting. And then because of that, he held three Eucharistic processions in response to this discriminating mass restrictions that were going on. Again, churches in that area, it's been different obviously in our state, churches in that area were not being treated the same as retail gyms and other places like that. Eventually, the U.S. Department of Justice actually had to get involved, and they warned the San Francisco officials that what they could be doing could be unconstitutional. And they said basically houses of worship had to be treated the same as gyms, tattoo parlors, hair salons, massage studios, and daycares. And so, again, for a bishop to be so actively speaking against this, what he called discrimination of Catholics, they obviously only do that when there is a serious pressing need. In Colorado, at St. Mary's Cathedral, which was in Colorado Springs, red paint was used to deface the statue of Mary in front of the cathedral. The cathedral sustained some damage because all spray painted throughout the church was "God is dead, there is no God." There was also anti-police, anti-religious phrases and slogans that were spray painted, and the doors of that cathedral were also permanently damaged. In Queen of Peace, this actually made a lot of news. I saw it mainly in the Catholic media. A car, as people were gathering, congregating to get ready for Mass, a car plowed into the church, and someone took 10 gallons of gasoline on the floor, set it on fire, and then sped off. That suspect was eventually arrested. He was charged with murder, attempted murder, arson, burglary, and evading arrest. The church sustained significant damage, and he even said after the attack that what he did was awesome, and said he had problems with the church. Again, very sad for these things to be happening. In Miami, there was the beheading of the statue of Christ, which led Archbishop Wensky to ask law enforcement to look into this as a hate crime, which led eventually the Department of Homeland Security and even other groups investigating that. So after that, the other church, when it was set on fire, immediately after that, not immediately, a couple hours after that, the parishioners gathered to celebrate Mass in the parish hall. So they still came together in the midst of that. In Chicago, as all that looting and rioting was going on, the Daughters of St. Paul, they operate a bookstore, and their bookstore was damaged by rocks. Looters entered the store. Nothing was actually taken. I'm guessing that was probably less religious persecution and more they were just looting all the stores, and so they went in there. They probably saw it was a religious bookstore, and there was probably nothing they wanted in there. So still sad, though, because those the Daughters of St. Paul, they obviously do so much to help promote the faith in different ways. In Kentucky, the Louisville Cathedral was damaged when rocks were thrown by protesters at the cathedral. The first basilica in the U.S. Suffered just minor damage when protesters tried to set an individual pew on fire, and it only suffered minor damage because the fire didn't spread. I'm going to try and go quickly because we seem to be going long again. Louisiana, for 2 hours, a man was basically running around a church in Louisiana and basically damaging everything that he possibly could. Statues, stained glass windows, furniture, multiple doors. He didn't actually enter the church. He just damaged the exterior, but for 2 hours was just, going around damaging a church. In New York, the Cathedral Prep School and Seminary in Brooklyn, a statue of Mary was defaced and spray painted with the words idol. The Shrine Church of Our Lady of Lords of Solace in Coney Island, a suspect climbs up, knocks a statue of the Virgin Mary off its base, and tosses it to the ground. St. Patrick's in New York, again, as the protests were happening there, was tagged with graffiti that said "No Justice, No Peace," BLM, NYPDK, which I'm not sure what that does, and the name of George Floyd was written on the steps. Interesting with all this, as they protest the church, the church does try to promote justice, and the church has spoken very much against what happened to George Floyd, so that's kind of surprising that they're just lumping the church in with everything else. Boston, a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary was set on fire. There were flowers in her hands, and those flowers were set on fire, and as that happened, that caused damage to a statue of the arms and face of our Blessed Mother. In Pennsylvania, the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul, a reader was finishing up her reading, and as that was happening, she was going to her seat, and a lady just walked up and punched her in the face. So that's a little more serious because it is involving a person, obviously. Tennessee, the pastor of Chattanooga found the statue of Mary knocked over and beheaded, and the head was never found. In Texas, El Paso, the St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Sacred Heart of Jesus statue was, destroyed, and the person who did it said it was because Jesus was the wrong color. Now, with this, obviously, we're always aware Jesus was not white. Mary was not white. They were obviously Jewish, and they would have looked just like any other Jewish person of their day. And so, with that, every culture does typically portray our Lord and also Mary in their culture, in their cultural way. So you can find Asian depictions of Mary, you can find African depictions of Mary and our Lord, obviously, and the same thing would also go. You can find some European things with that. In Dallas, St. Jude Chapel was severely damaged by rocks when rocks were thrown through the window. In Utah, a statue of St. Teresa was smashed to the ground, and the next night, the parish residence was broken into. In Alexandria, thieves went in and took the tabernacle and the Eucharist. The tabernacle was eventually found partially submerged in water, and the Eucharist was never found. It could have possibly just dissolved in water. In Canada, there was actually, because so many churches had been destroyed in some way. There was a group that was started called Protecting Our Sacred Statues, and it was actually started by a person who was born in Indonesia, who lived through much persecution, and he was so impressed that when he came to Canada, he wasn't being pressured to convert to Islam, which was, in Indonesia, which was happening to him, and he was so kind of, I guess, moved, if you will, by all these vandalisms that were happening in Canada, that he started this group to protect the sacred sites in Canada. This is a little different. This has been happening since the beginning of time, and it's happened very much in the modern age in certain sectors of the world. In Ethiopia, more than 500 Christians were murdered in door-to-door attacks, and these people who did this, they arrived with guns, machetes, swords, and spears, and apparently the police just stood by and watched this happen. Martyrdom does still happen in the world. There's been actually more martyrs in the past century than there have in all the other centuries combined. So people dying for their faith, as horrific as that is, it's certainly something we should still be aware does happen throughout the world. In Germany, an unknown assailant punched a priest during Sunday Mass in the face. He was quietly sitting in the church, got up, spat on the ground, uttered some anti-religious sentiments, and then punched the priest to the ground, knocking him to the ground, took a Bible and tore out 7 pages. In India, there was a father and son. They were Protestant, who they were arrested, and they died from apparently internal injuries sustained through sexual assault committed by police officers with batons. And in India, they were actually saying this was a George Floyd moment because of the persecution that does happen in India. In Italy, Satanists actually toppled a wooden statue of Jesus, and they had a piece of cardboard over it that said Satan, and the statue was brought down and severely disfaced. In Sicily, 2 suspects were in custody after they desecrated the Eucharist and destroyed multiple sacred objects. In the church that contained the relics of St. Agatha, that church was vandalized, and the body of St. Agatha was desecrated, and also the tabernacle was broken into, and hosts were destroyed and placed on the ground, and a destroyed statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Also in Italy, a golden crystal case containing drops of blood of St. John Paul II were stolen from a cathedral in Italy. In Poland, there was such dismay about all this that the Polish bishops actually issued a statement expressing concern over frequent cases of profanation on places of worship and also religious symbols. And there was also, in Poland, there was a rainbow flag that was placed on a historic statue of Christ in Warsaw. Even some political figures have gotten involved. Again, not endorsing candidates or unendorsing candidates in any way because of this. Apparently there's a political activist named Sean King. I'm not sure who he is. He has up to 1 million Twitter followers, and he basically tweeted that statues, murals, stained glass windows, anything depicting white Jesus and his European mother should be torn down and destroyed. Again, in all of these things, the church always has depicted our Lord and also his mother in ways that are expressive of the cultures in which they find themselves. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's a Democrat in New York, again, political affiliation doesn't mean anything with this. She said that the statue of St. Damien the Leper, who did so much to help the indigenous people in Hawaii, said was a symbol of patriarchy and the white supremacist culture. Even President Obama actually had expressed admiration for the life of Blessed Damien. So again, it's just kind of this rereading of history that isn't always accurate. President Trump eventually had to sign an executive order that was vowing criminal persecution for those who destroyed monuments, murals, and that also included religious property. So this video did go a little long. Sorry about that. It just has been, disconcerting to see so many sacred places and sacred objects being destroyed and vandalized in some form or another. And so for anyone who has done this, our response as a people of faith is always love. We always are called to forgive those who have done this, and we're called to pray for a better understanding of why our Lord is depicted the way he is in certain places, and also why these objects are so important to us. And again, our response is never to retaliate in a way that we may have been targeted, but it's always to express love. Some of this has calmed down. Most of this was throughout the summer, but this does still seem to be an issue that didn't garner much attention. And so it's important for us that our faith should, especially when there are so many individual attacks on places of worship, we should have enough of a presence in the media where when these things do happen, it does go on to at least get some note in some media outlets. Some of these have been noted in media outlets, but there hasn't been much national attention on this. So just some Monday musings on churches being vandalized and what we can do as a response. Sorry for this long video. I wasn't aware it was going to take so long. See you soon, St. Catherine's.